Welcome everyone. My name is Katie Morris. I'm an AmeriCorps member at MountainTrue. I do our outings and education programs. So you're joining us today as part of our MountainTrue University Speaker Series. So every Wednesday at 11:30, one of our staff or some folks that we work with will give a short presentation about something that they have a lot of expertise in or an area of our work that we want to share with you all. If you're coming to this and not super familiar with MountainTrue, we're a regional environmental conservation nonprofit that works to protect the water quality, public lands, and communities of our region. Today, we're going to hear from Chris Joyell. He's the director of the Asheville Design Center, which is a program of MountainTrue that works in our local communities, doing things like community planning, helping communities have design that works better for them, and then also better for the environment. So before I pass it off to Chris, I'm going to do just a quick orientation to Zoom for those of you who are not familiar with how this platform works. You should see down at the bottom of your screen a chat and a Q&A option. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A as we go. We'll take questions as the presentation goes so that they can be answered when they're still relevant. And if you have any technical issues, feel free to put them in the chat, but primarily we'll stick to the Q&A. Since this is a webinar rather than a meeting, we can't see or hear you, so no worries there. But you'll be able to see Chris's screen once he starts his presentation. And so with that, thank you all for joining us, and I'll pass it over to Chris.
All right. Get my screen up. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion around urban renewal, the history of urban renewal here in Asheville. My name is Chris Joyell, and as Katie mentioned, I'm the director of the Asheville Design Center, have been since 2008. Let's see. The Asheville Design Center merged with MountainTrue back in 2017 in an effort to bring a stronger focus onto the built environment, recognizing the work that MountainTrue has been doing in the natural environment for decades. The merger allowed for us to also turn our focus to the built environment and create wonderful places for where we spend the vast majority of our time. The Design Center itself got its start back in 2006 when we, a group of designers here in town, took on the I-26 connector, and we had envisioned a new highway design that could extend Patton Avenue all the way to the Bowen Bridge. We had many other features in that design that we had originally conceived, but for now, that's the piece that I think has survived and has the most promise. I-26 is moving ahead, and we're really pleased to say that our design was ultimately adopted by DOT and then slightly changed, but I won't go down that path right now. It's unusual for a design center to start out taking on a project of that scale and of that nature. Design centers in general were formed in response to urban renewal. Back in the 1970s, designers, I think on the heels of the 1961 book written by Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Cities, designers took up the call to provide design services and advice and conceptual design to communities that were being planned upon. And for urban renewal, as we'll see today, many communities were being planned upon, not planned with. Design centers were created in response to that. So after 2006, as we started to gain our footing around the I-26 project, I connected with Julie Mayfield, who was new to town, just starting up as the director of the Western North Carolina Alliance. And she and I got together and we decided to work together to extend that spirit of what a design center is supposed to do and work in the Burton Street community. That is a community in West Asheville that had twice been bisected by highway projects. The I-26 project and the expansion of Patton Ave had huge impacts on that community. And suddenly with the new I-26 project that was being proposed, they were looking at losing another 25 houses and a church as part of that process. Our design was able to scale that back and at one point eliminate any takings from that neighborhood. But the community wanted to look beyond the highway project and really think what could it do for itself and how could they better improve their own neighborhood. And that's how we got going, how the Western North Carolina Alliance, which later became MountainTrue, and ADC first began working together. So Julie and I have been working together for over a decade, and look back on Burton Street very fondly with the work that we started there. So as I mentioned, design centers, formed in response to urban renewal. Urban renewal itself, if you're not familiar with it, has a fascinating history, disturbing history as well. But it really started back in a post-World War II era when the federal government enacted 3 statutes that really helped shape the urban renewal policies that drove it across the country. And there was the Housing Act of 1949, the Housing Act of 1954, and then the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Those 3 acts gave the federal government incredible resources and authority to acquire land, to remove families from their homes, to demolish businesses, and to literally pave the way to a new future with the resources available to the Federal Highway Administration. So for over 3 decades, the federal government funded this nationwide policy of demolition and large-scale clearance. You will hear references when people talk about urban renewal of urban decay or blight, and this was a program that was really geared primarily on removing that blight. These were dilapidated neighborhoods that were seen as holding back development of downtowns across America, and the solution was to basically eradicate them and relocate people to public housing. So from 1950 to 1980, wrecking crews demolished roughly 7.5 million dwelling units and displaced over 100,000 businesses in the process. So 1 out of every 17 homes in America was demolished as part of the urban renewal program. The poster child for urban renewal is the Pruitt-Igoe complex that was constructed in St. Louis on 57 acres in downtown St. Louis, about 2 miles northwest of the Arch. This project took place. It was not the first. The first actually took place in Pittsburgh with the Mellon family really pushing for redevelopment of the Golden Triangle in Pittsburgh. And that was another example of one that just eradicated a neighborhood in place of civic structures and buildings. But the St. Louis project was one that really stood out. It was developed in 1954, and the idea was to, I think this goes across the board for urban renewal, was to try and provide families with running water, running electricity, and a solid roof over their heads. And throughout many of these neighborhoods, that wasn't necessarily the case. They were definitely low-income neighborhoods that had a lot of structures that were of questionable integrity. We'll get to why that was a little bit further in this presentation, but just understanding the underlying intent behind the program. And I've said this before to folks that have been that have gone on tours with me or heard about this. I think if we were to take the most benevolent look at this program, we would say that was its intent, was to put a solid roof over people's heads with running water and electricity. There's many other, I think, motives that are at play here, but we'll leave that where it is right now. With Pruitt-Igoe, what they ended up doing was transforming what was a traditional neighborhood into a high-rise neighborhood, and one where the federal government provided the funding for the construction, for the acquisition of the land and for the construction of the complex, but did not provide any federal assistance for the management and the maintenance of that area. So over the course of years, as people started to discover that it was not a very livable community, as one that's vertically stacked and really kind of separated people from the street and removed very much the sense of community, the businesses that proliferated through that area, vacancies began to pop up throughout the complex. And as vacancies began to mount, the maintenance revenue began to drop. And so within a very short period of time, the Pruitt-Igoe became an eyesore, it became unmanageable, And within 2 decades, the city decided to demolish the entire complex. So within the span of just 20 years, this grand experiment was deemed a failure, and it was one that gained a lot of notoriety throughout the country as this failed experiment in social engineering. And so it's kind of odd because for Asheville, we were very late to the game for urban renewal. We did not really embrace urban renewal here until the early 80s. The very late 70s, early 80s is when we really did the most urban renewal projects here in Asheville. And that was 10 years after we saw the Pruitt-Igoe failure being broadcast across the country. So to understand the context of why Asheville was so late to the game, it's important to also understand our financial history. Asheville was a city, back in the 20s, during the roaring 20s, one that took advantage of the bond programs, issuing a number of bonds for its program for progress. It was a program that funded our water supply system, built our city hall, and overall just funded a number of different projects. The price tag was $56 million at the time. That's $800 million today that the city took out in bonds to undertake all these ambitious programs in the 20s. Well, with the stock market collapse and the onset of the Great Depression in the early 30s, most, if not all, actually all cities other than Asheville of our size at that time chose to default on their bonds. For reasons that I'm still unclear on, Asheville elected not to default on their bonds. And so as a result, we carried enormous debt for over 50 years. And as we carried that debt, we saw more opportunities pass by that Asheville could not take part in because we simply didn't have the revenue. Investment in our downtown plummeted. The silver lining to that, by the way, is that many of the buildings that we celebrate downtown, the buildings that we love, the Jackson building, I can just kind of go down the list of all of the architectural splendors that we have downtown. Many cities during this period of post-World War II chose to tear down buildings of those designs and build more modern structures, similar to what the BB&T Tower represented back in the 60s. So Asheville, in a way, was almost fortunate to be saddled with so much debt and unable to invest in its downtown because we were able to preserve a lot of the architecture that people celebrate today. Now, it's great to say that today, but you would not be saying that in 1980. Back then, as we were reaching the end of our debt obligations and really seeing the result of lack of investment for over 50 years, we had a downtown that was facing at times up to 90% vacancy. And it's just hard to imagine Pack Square as you see it right here before you and compare it to today. It's hard to imagine just what the city was going through at that time. There was a real push to bring investment back to the city as we came out from under that debt. And some of that came in the form of federal highways. And that's when we saw the construction of I-240, and you're looking at the cut on I-240 in Bowcatcher Mountain, alongside it Tunnel Road, and the tunnel that has proven effective at moving cars through mountains rather than notches, but another sidetrack that I won't go on. But I-240 and I-26 were both developed in the early 80s, and uncharacteristic of many of the cities here in North Carolina, we actively recruited the federal agencies to bring those highways into our city limits. Rather than having a beltway on the outside of our city, we decided to bring those highways right through the center of our downtown in an effort to try and inject activity, life, investment in our downtown that had been moribund for so long. It did not directly touch Valley Street, the federal highway projects, but we did have NCDOT begin its work, and it started in Valley Street. You're looking at Valley Street right now, and I'll move my cursor so you can kind of see where we are. Valley Street really represented the heart of the south side of Asheville's traditional Black community. You'll see Stevens Lee High School is up here. That was a segregated high school. Asheville itself was segregated until 1960. And as a result, the city definitely physically was segregated as well, where the majority of the white population lived in North Asheville and further south. But the south side of downtown was populated by African American community, and Valley Street served as the main conduit through that community. We'll talk a little bit about the history of what happens to Valley Street, but this is just to give you a glimpse of what the community looked like prior to urban renewal. It was definitely dense urban development and bustling with activity. This is just taking a look back up. I believe it is up Valley Street. If you can imagine, City Hall would be off to your left. But again, really active area, a lot of eyes on the street, a lot of activity, that kind of sign of a vibrant community. Adjacent to Valley Street was a district known as the Block. And the Block served as the financial center for African Americans across Western North Carolina for years. And the Block at one point hosted over 280 African American owned businesses. So I mentioned that Asheville had been segregated all the way up until 1960. In a way, it also provided the impetus for creating these two separate economies, where we had a white economy and a Black economy. So lawyers, dentists, funeral home parlors, grocery stores, everything was set up kind of mirroring one another, where you had a white economy that provided all the services and a Black economy that provided all the services to their respective communities. And the Block represented the heart of that. Really right behind today, if you're in that area, the Eagle Market Street Junction is kind of the heart of the Block, just to give you a sense of where we're talking about. And the YMI Center was the community center that started, I want to say, back in 1910, as kind of the heart of that community. Surrounding Valley Street and the Block, we have a number of residential neighborhoods that were also impacted by urban renewal. The East End, as well as the South Side and East Riverside, which is now, think about like the Livingston neighborhood, South French Broad neighborhood, portions of the River Arts District that were heavily populated with African American community, and really one that suffered the brunt of urban renewal here in Asheville. So as I go into, just to show you a little bit of the scale of what was being undertaken, I want to just give you an idea of little old Asheville back in 1980 and the projects that we took on. The East Riverside Urban Renewal Project, which was only one of several projects that we had under the umbrella of urban renewal. The East Riverside project represented the largest single urban renewal project in the Southeast. Give you an idea, it's about 425 acres of land that were cleared, 1,300 structures, and 1,250 families that were displaced. That's representative of over half of our city's African American population that was displaced just by one project alone. In addition to East Riverside, Asheville also conducted several other smaller residential programs that directly impacted the communities of Stumptown and Montford, in the Hill Street neighborhood in Montford, East End, as I had just mentioned, adjacent to Valley Street, and Burton Street over in West Asheville. So the urban renewal program, when it did finally show up in Asheville, had a tremendous impact on our African American community, and displaced numerous families and placed them into public housing that was sprouting up throughout the city. Lee Walker Heights was our first public housing development. That was back actually in 1950, but spurred by the federal dollars that were coming with the urban renewal program, our housing authority, the Housing Authority of the City of Asheville, and that's what HACA stands for, they were overseeing the federal dollars that were coming into our community. So they were acquiring the land for federal projects, and they were building new public housing to provide homes for those displaced families. This is a scan of a HACA map that was literally saved out of a dumpster at the housing authority. An employee there saw these maps going into the garbage, pulled them out, and hand delivered them to me. And it's really an incredible insight into what was happening at the time. Now, you're not going to get to see the detail here, and we'll zoom in just a second. But I just wanted to give you the scope of what we're looking at, just to help you. Here's City Hall. Here's the county building. So imagine Pack Square Park is right over here. And Valley Street runs right through here. And that Valley Street will become South Charlotte Street. So to give you a perspective of where we are, just imagine South Charlotte Street that's running behind City Hall and making its way towards Biltmore Ave. That's what this map is capturing. What you see here in all these shaded portions from green, brown, and red just represent different phases of acquisition that the Housing Authority was undertaking to create the pathway for the MLK Boulevard. So every house that sits underneath these blocks was acquired for a roadway and essentially building a 4-lane highway that would move traffic from North Asheville through the South Asheville neighborhoods very quickly and usher people down into Biltmore Village and beyond. And later we saw South Asheville, South Charlotte Street receive the same treatment, where we ended up getting a 5-lane highway running through what was a very dense residential neighborhood. So here's just an idea, just to give you an idea of after that acquisition, the pathway that was being laid out for MLK Boulevard. So to zoom in a little, it's a little tough on these maps because they are blueprints. So there's not a lot of contrast, but I felt like it would be really helpful if we could zoom in on one of these maps and just be able to get a glimpse of what was actually happening on the ground. So again, here we have City Hall, and right behind it, here's Valley Street. And you'll see right here, proposed NCDOT right-of-way. That's where you can anticipate South Charlotte Street is going to be coming right through here. So throughout this map, you see a lot of rectangles, and these are all representative of homes or structures. They most often contain businesses on the first floor, residences on the second and third floors. So you were packing a lot of people into a very tight area, and those businesses that I had mentioned earlier within the block, and you're looking at a lot of that, this is the block. Those businesses were supported by density in these neighborhoods. By having so many people living in such close quarters, you're able to support a number of businesses like that. But as those families were being displaced, those businesses lost the density that they thrived upon, and thus we lost about 280 businesses as a part of that process. For many African-American families here in Asheville that had come over, many families that had moved here in the late 1800s to help with the construction of the Biltmore estate, for about 100 years, families were acquiring wealth not within their domiciles, not within their personal property. And we're going to address that in just a second. But it was the family businesses where a lot of that wealth was being accumulated and handed down from one generation to the next. So when a lot of these families saw their businesses evaporate as their community was being ripped apart, they also saw that familial wealth that had been building up for 100 years evaporate overnight. So to give you an idea, in looking at this map, every structure that you see that is shaded purple or hashed in purple, that the diagonal of purple represents deteriorating, and full purple represents dilapidated. And those two designations gave the housing authority the authority to be able to take those homes. So imagine just on any given day, eventually somewhere in the late 70s, you got a knock on the door, and someone presented you with a check, I'm sure a paltry check for the value of your property, which we'll see in a few photos coming up. A lot of these properties weren't in great condition. They didn't have running water. Many shared communal toilets. Running electricity was not a foregone conclusion. And so for a number of those properties, families were presented with a very small check and told that they were being relocated, and had no real choice in the matter. There was no legal way to stop that from happening because of eminent domain that the city was able to exercise. So I learned that story back in 2010 when we first began working as the design center, first began working in the block and looking at development patterns in the block and trying to chart a path for what it can look like in the future. That's when I first began to get introduced to the story of urban renewal. I myself, I grew up in Connecticut, and New Haven was actually the largest recipient of federal dollars per capita for urban renewal. And yet I had never heard of it. No one taught us that in school, and it was not discussed, in most circles. So it was news to me. And moving to Asheville, and then working, and having lived in Asheville for over 5 years at this point, and then beginning to work in the block with East End residents, with Southside residents, telling me the history of urban renewal in our community, I was shocked. And I learned, that a lot of these houses, and I picked out these structures in particular because they do demonstrate what would qualify as dilapidated or deteriorating households. These houses were in this state of disrepair, but understanding why that is and how those houses got to that condition is really important to understand. And I think it's important to remember that these are working neighborhoods. We had 280 businesses in these neighborhoods that were thriving. So there was revenue coming in, but there was not a whole lot that was staying in the community. There are a number of federal programs that can explain that. There's exclusionary zoning. There are deed restrictions, which Asheville had throughout town, that basically restricted deeds, the deed of a property being transferred to say someone of African American descent, and basically barring families from moving into particular neighborhoods and isolating those communities very much so. But the one program that I really wanted to focus on the tail end of this presentation is what came out of the Depression and the New Deal, and in an effort to make it easier for banks to make loans, the federal government under FDR set up the Homeowners Loan Corporation. That's a government-sponsored corporation that was created as part of the New Deal, and it was advising banks on where to make their loans. And as part of that, you're going to hear a reference sometimes to redlining and to Hulk maps. And those Hulk maps, this is Asheville's Hulk map. This map represents the loan risk, the risk that banks would be exposing themselves to should they make loans in particular neighborhoods. I'll zoom in just so you can get a little bit clearer idea of how these maps are delineated. Neighborhoods in green, neighborhoods in blue were first and second grade levels for loans, which meant relatively safe environments for loans, and banks would readily make loans to those neighborhoods. So if you were buying a new house, or if you wanted to build an addition on your house, if you wanted to put a new roof on your house, if you wanted to upgrade the electricity in your house and you wanted to get a home equity loan, banks were going to open the door to you if you lived in one of these green or blue areas. Yellow, it gets a little bit more questionable. Red, though, represents definitely out of the question. Banks were not making loans to communities that lay within these red lines. So that's where you hear the term redlining. To give you a sense of what we're looking at here in Asheville, here's the central business district, is grayed out. The area that had been redlined around it composes the entire East End, Valley Street, the block, going all the way into the Southside neighborhood and the East Riverside neighborhood. This entire area basically did not see any type of bank investment for nearly 45 years. So no one was getting a mortgage, no one was getting home improvement funds. And I think it goes a long way to explain why so many of the houses in these neighborhoods were in a dilapidated state. They simply did not have the resources to upgrade them. And if you leave a house untouched for 45 years, it's not going to look so good at that point, and it can even become unsafe. I think it's also really important to look at the surgical precision that the banks were using in delineating these red zones from blue and green zones. Just to give you an idea, over in the West Asheville neighborhood, what you see here redlined is the Burton Street neighborhood. Now, if you hop over Florida Ave and Dorchester into the Brucemont neighborhood, you'll see that if you were just 2 streets over, you were able to get a loan from the bank readily. Whereas if you lived in Burton Street, no loan was forthcoming. So I think it goes a long way to explain how federal policies ended up setting the stage for urban renewal, and in many ways created the situation that beckoned for urban renewal to take place. The legacy of urban renewal, and particularly redlining, is pretty drastic and is still with us today. These were maps that I got from UNC. I'm not crazy about the term that they're using here, but that's what they chose. But to give you an idea of how the historical outlines of our redlining have really impacted our community over the years, you can just see in our demography how that's reflected. Income levels, it remains reflected from these kind of historical policies. Even just the location of grocery stores. You will hear about food deserts, and the South Side is definitely one of those areas that I think may not federally qualify as a food desert, but in all intents and purposes, it is. You have to get in a car if you're going to find a grocery store. More often than not, it's going to be more than 2 miles away. So that's just a brief recap. I want to just recommend a publication that I think provides a great insight into how the community was thriving up until urban renewal and what happened in its aftermath. And that's coming from the North Carolina Humanities Council and their Crossroads publication. In particular, Sarah Judson authored Twilight of a Neighborhood. She's from UNC Asheville. She wrote this in 2010. It's a 10-page document. I would absolutely recommend you checking it out. If you just do a search on Twilight of a Neighborhood, Asheville, and you'll find the PDF pretty quickly. It's a great resource. Another one is we took on a project back in 2013, I believe, where the artist Molly Must worked with us and Just Folks. This is Bubbles Griffin, former president of Just Folks. We teamed up with them to create a 270-foot linear mural in Triangle Park to tell the story of Black Asheville from its very inception up to the modern day, and with almost 13 separate panels that kind of walk you through decade by decade. And it tells an incredible story of the history of Black Asheville, and one that was directly informed and created by the community itself. So you can find Triangle Park. It's right behind Barley's off of Biltmore Ave on South Market Street. I definitely recommend you going down there and checking it out. It is the last vestige of the walk that remains today. But I think the mural and Molly did an amazing job of capturing the history of that area and really trying to seal that in amber for future generations as well. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I think I've gone a little bit over my time, but I would love to take any questions that you may have. I have my contact information available here. Encourage you, if you have any questions that crop up later, to feel free to follow up with me. And I will thank you for taking part in this and turn things back over to Katie.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much for that presentation. If folks have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll hand them over to Chris. Otherwise, I'll send everyone this recording and a follow-up survey tomorrow. So thank you for joining, and feel free to add any questions that you have for us. We'll hang out for another couple minutes in case folks have questions.
And Katie, I don't know if it's worth mentioning. I don't even know if it's feasible anymore, but I know that you and I had discussed actually conducting a downtown walking tour, and we led a walking tour last year, starting out at Triangle Park and then walking throughout downtown to look at various projects downtown. This year, prior to the pandemic, we had actually planned on teaming up with Flying Bikes. Outfit here that has electric bikes for rent, and we were going to offer an electric bike tour starting down in the East Riverside neighborhood and working our way through the South Side, eventually all the way up into downtown. Still would love to do that, and I would encourage anyone that's taking part in this webinar today to keep tabs on us to see if that is something that does materialize. We were hoping to do it in the fall, but I'm sure, like so many plans that we've made, we're not sure how that's going to pan out right now. But know that if for some reason it does seem feasible, we will certainly share that with participants today, and would love to have you join us. It'd be a great way to see the city, learn about the history of our city, and enjoy an electric bike ride while you're at it.
Yeah, that's on our website. It's scheduled for the 26th of September for right now, so folks can already go ahead and sign up. And of course, if you sign up, excuse me, if you sign up and plans change, we'll let you know. And I believe there's a small ticket cost associated with it, but if we end up having to change that event, we'll refund folks. So we hope to be able to offer it because I think it would be a great experience.
I don't know how it would work remotely. If I'm out there biking around with the camera, I don't think it would have the same impact. But yeah, it would be great if we could get folks out there in person. So we'll have to see where we're at in September.
Well, I don't see any questions coming in. Eliza had joined and said she had questions for you later, but she had to run to a meeting. So I know at least you can expect questions from one person after the fact, but I don't see any other questions coming in at the moment. So
all right,
we can go ahead and sign off.
Well, if